Adrian Cole, Marcus Hale, and Victor Renaud, three names whispered in fear across Canada's underworld. Together, they built the North Syndicate, an empire of crime that rose from the frozen streets of Toronto and spread across the nation. They were ghosts who moved in silence, men who left no evidence, no witnesses, and no mercy. But behind the wealth, the discipline, and the blood buried in the snow, their empire was already beginning to crack, and what followed would become one of the most shocking gang stories in Canadian history. In the frozen streets of Toronto, where the city lights flickered against icy sidewalks, a quiet but dangerous power was beginning to grow. The rise of what would later be known as the North Syndicate did not come with dramatic gunfights or flashy headlines in the beginning. It started almost invisibly, with small acts of crime that barely caught the attention of authorities. Groups of young men, many of them from tough neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce, found themselves drawn together not just by friendship but by survival. They began stealing cars, breaking into dealerships under the cover of night, and dismantling the vehicles in hidden garages. The stolen parts were shipped across the border to buyers who asked no questions. These early crimes brought in cash, fast, easy, and untraceable. But it also brought something else: confidence. With every successful theft, the group learned how to move more carefully, how to cover their tracks, and how to keep law enforcement guessing. What separated them from countless other petty criminals was the discipline they imposed on themselves. While many street gangs flaunted their money and power, posting photos, buying loud cars, or stirring violence for the sake of reputation, this crew believed in invisibility. They avoided unnecessary fights, blended into neighborhoods, and never stayed too long in one place. Their silence was their shield, and soon it became their most terrifying weapon. Word spread through underground circles that there was a new group in Toronto, one that operated like shadows. They left no traces, no witnesses, and no mistakes. Rivals began to realize that going against them wasn't just risky, it was suicidal, as Untold. The years passed. Their operations expanded beyond stolen cars. They grew bolder, moving into armed robberies that funded larger schemes. A jewelry store in downtown Toronto was hit in a matter of minutes, the thieves masked and organized with military precision. The robbers vanished before police sirens could even approach. No fingerprints were found, no security cameras caught usable footage, and no suspects were named. For detectives, it was as if the city itself had swallowed the criminals whole. These jobs provided bigger money, and with them came bigger connections. The North Syndicate began dealing with underground networks that stretched far beyond Canada, gaining access to smuggling routes, drug suppliers, and weapons dealers. What began as a local crew of thieves had turned into a structured criminal unit with growing ambitions. But what made them so different, so unnerving, was the way they built fear without speaking a word. Unlike gangs who spray-painted tags on walls or paraded through neighborhoods to prove dominance, the North Syndicate thrived on mystery. People whispered about them, but few claimed to know who they really were. If someone got too close, that person seemed to vanish or suddenly decided to stop asking questions. Police officers working in organized crime units privately admitted they had little to work with. Files were thin, informants were terrified, and operations often ended in dead ends. The lack of evidence didn't calm the city. It only amplified the syndicate's myth. They weren't just criminals, they were phantoms that stalked Toronto's underworld. By the mid-2000s, signs of their growing empire could no longer be ignored. Drugs began circulating in neighborhoods where they had never been seen before. Weapons appeared in the hands of smaller street gangs who seemed newly connected, and money laundering fronts, car washes, nightclubs, and shipping companies sprang up almost overnight. Every move seemed calculated, every step carefully placed to avoid exposure. The North Syndicate had learned to study law enforcement as closely as law enforcement studied them. They knew how long it took for warrants to be processed, how surveillance operations were carried out, and which officers could be bribed to look the other way. It was an education in crime unlike anything Toronto had seen before. What made the situation more chilling was how ordinary their leaders appeared to the outside world. Neighbors described them as polite, quiet men who never drew attention to themselves. They lived in modest houses, drove average cars, and kept their families out of sight. To most, they seemed like hard-working immigrants or young professionals. Yet beneath this facade, they were building one of the most dangerous organizations Canada would ever face. This dual existence, ordinary on the surface but ruthless beneath, allowed them to slip through cracks that swallowed less disciplined gangs. The silence of their rise became its own kind of violence. Murders that were tied to them rarely looked like gang executions. Victims disappeared rather than being left in alleys or cars. Businesses that resisted them suddenly shut down with no explanation. Communities learned to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention, and to never ever ask questions. Fear spread in a way bullets never could. By the time authorities realized the scale of the North Syndicate's growth, it was already too late. They had risen from petty car thieves to an invisible empire that stretched across Toronto's underworld, and they had done it without anyone noticing until their power was already cemented. The winter that marked the Syndicate's true arrival into power was unlike any the city had experienced before. Snow piled high on the streets of Toronto, covering every corner in silence. Yet beneath that silence, something brutal was unfolding. By then, whispers of the Syndicate had spread through the underworld, and rivals were beginning to test their patience. Small gangs thought they could carve pieces of territory for themselves, not realizing that challenging the Syndicate was like stepping into a trap. It started with missing men, leaders of competing groups who had pushed too far into Syndicate-controlled areas. For weeks, no one knew where they had gone. Families filed police reports, friends searched, but the streets remained quiet. Then, when the ice had hardened thick enough over abandoned land outside the city, the truth revealed itself in the most horrifying way possible. Buried deep under layers of frozen earth and ice were 3 bodies, each belonging to the men who had dared to oppose the Syndicate. Their discovery was not by accident. Hunters crossing through an abandoned quarry stumbled upon the grisly scene after noticing a section of ground that looked recently disturbed. Police were called, and what they found became headline news across the country. The victims had been killed with a precision that made the crime feel more like a warning than an act of rage. Their hands were bound, their faces marked with signs of torture, and their bodies positioned in a way that could not be mistaken. This was not random violence. It was a message carved into the frozen landscape of Canada. The message was clear. Challenge the Syndicate, and you will vanish into the snow. The killings shocked not just law enforcement, but the public as well. While ordinary citizens rarely paid close attention to gang politics, the brutality of this discovery forced everyone to take notice. News anchors described the case as one of the most chilling gang-related killings in Canadian history. For the first time, the name the North Syndicate was spoken aloud on television, even if officials had no concrete proof to tie them directly to the crime. Detectives, however, were convinced. The precision of the murders, the lack of evidence at the quarry, and the clean way the bodies had been disposed of pointed to an organization that understood fear better than most. The Syndicate had never been violent for the sake of violence. They did not spray bullets into crowded streets or stage chaotic shootouts that risked attention. Instead, they reserved their brutality for carefully chosen moments, each killing crafted to send a ripple of dread across the underworld. These murders in the snow were exactly that. They cemented the Syndicate's reputation as an entity that could not be challenged. Rival gangs, once bold enough to compete, suddenly withdrew. Deals were canceled, territories were surrendered without a fight, and entire groups relocated to other cities just to avoid crossing paths with the Syndicate again. Fear, more than weapons or numbers, had become their greatest weapon. The psychological effect of these killings stretched further than most could imagine. Detectives working on the case admitted privately that even officers felt uneasy. The idea of men capable of burying rivals under frozen ground with no witnesses, no mistakes, and no leaks spread unease through the ranks. If law enforcement could not find a trace, what hope did smaller gangs have? The syndicate's silence was deafening. They never claimed responsibility. They never boasted. They simply allowed the blood in the snow to speak for them. Communities began whispering about the killings. Mothers warned their sons to stay off the streets. Shop owners closed early, and rumors swirled that anyone speaking too loudly about the syndicate risked becoming the next disappearance. In places where gang activity was once visible, graffiti covered, walls, loud cars, territorial fights, there was now a heavy stillness. The syndicate had achieved something far more powerful than control. They had created an atmosphere of fear that worked in their favor without them needing to show their faces. For the police, the murders became the turning point in their understanding of what they were up against. These were not reckless criminals making mistakes out of desperation. These were disciplined operators who planned each move with cold precision. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to uncover clues from the frozen quarry, but every lead fell apart. No fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA. The killers had stripped the site clean, using methods detectives had only seen in cases involving international crime syndicates. It was as if the perpetrators wanted investigators to know they were outmatched. Even though the city reeled from the brutality, the syndicate's influence only grew stronger in the shadows. With rivals eliminated, they no longer faced challenges for control of smuggling routes and street corners. Drug pipelines opened wider, stolen goods moved faster, and money flowed in greater amounts than ever before. Every dollar earned was built on the foundation of fear established by the bodies in the snow. Those 3 murders were not simply about revenge or punishment. They were the beginning of an empire's dominance. Years later, survivors from smaller gangs would recall that winter as the moment everything changed. It was when the Underworld realized that the syndicate did not fight wars. They ended them before they began. It was when the city, wrapped in ice and silence, learned that true terror doesn't always roar. It can whisper, buried beneath the snow. After the winter killings that shook Toronto and silenced the syndicate's rivals, the organization shifted into a new phase of power. No longer content with merely controlling neighborhoods or intimidating small-time gangs, they began weaving themselves into the fabric of Canada's underground economy. The blood in the snow had cleared the path for them, and now nothing stood in their way. What started as a crew of thieves had transformed into a vast network of organized crime with tentacles spreading from one end of the country to the other. The syndicate understood something that most gangs never grasped. Survival depended on adaptation. Instead of relying solely on street violence, they began building connections that reached into legitimate businesses. Trucking companies became their backbone. To outsiders, these companies looked like hard-working logistics firms transporting frozen food, lumber, and consumer goods across the country. In reality, the syndicate had discovered the perfect camouflage. Inside refrigerated containers, tucked behind pallets of fish or stacks of frozen meat, lay cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine smuggled across the U.S. border. The shipments moved along highways every day, blending into the endless stream of commercial traffic that law enforcement had no chance of fully monitoring. The profits were staggering. Within a few years, millions of dollars were flowing through their hands every month. With this money, they bought influence, bribed officials, and expanded their reach into other cities. Montreal became a hub for distribution. Calgary became a financial laundering base, and Vancouver provided access to Asian networks eager to trade in weapons and narcotics. The North Syndicate was no longer just a gang operating in Toronto. It was a nationwide empire that connected to global black markets. Their ability to hide in plain sight astonished investigators. Nightclubs were purchased and turned into fronts for laundering money. Restaurants and car washes suddenly flourished under new ownership, their books filled with carefully balanced numbers that masked illegal cash. Even real estate developments were quietly funded with dirty money, transforming neighborhoods while cleaning the syndicate's profits. To ordinary citizens, These businesses looked like signs of economic growth. Few realized that the wealth pouring into their communities was stained with blood. What made the syndicate so frightening was not just their control of drugs and money, but their mastery of silence. Police relied heavily on informants to break open organized crime cases, but the syndicate had perfected ways of silencing potential leaks. Members were bound by fear, not loyalty. Anyone suspected of talking faced swift and certain punishment. Bodies didn't always surface. Sometimes men simply vanished, leaving their families to wonder if they had fled or been swallowed by the streets. The uncertainty was its own kind of terror. Informants, terrified of becoming the next disappearance, refused to cooperate with investigators. Prosecutors had cases with no witnesses, detectives had files with no evidence, and communities lived under a shadow that seemed impossible to escape. Despite this, the syndicate's leaders never drew attention to themselves. Unlike the flashier gangs who posted photos with stacks of cash or guns, the syndicate's upper ranks lived modestly, at least on the surface. They drove ordinary cars, wore simple clothes, and avoided the kind of behavior that attracted police. They knew that invisibility was their greatest strength. It allowed them to move across borders, negotiate with foreign suppliers, and invest in businesses without sparking suspicion. This deliberate humility became part of their mythology. The most powerful criminals in Canada were also the least visible, yet cracks occasionally showed through the armor. Seizures of drugs at border points revealed just how much they were moving, even if investigators couldn't directly tie the shipments to them. Weapons traced back to global suppliers were discovered in the hands of smaller gangs who had become dependent on the syndicate's pipeline. Every discovery pointed to the same conclusion. The syndicate's influence stretched far beyond what authorities could control. And with each failure to stop them, their reputation grew. They were no longer just the ghosts of Toronto. They were the silent rulers of Canada's underworld. Communities began to feel the impact of their growing dominance. Drugs flooded neighborhoods, fueling addiction crises that tore apart families. Violence, though carefully controlled by the syndicate, still bled into the streets through their associates and distributors. Small gangs became satellites of the empire, orbiting around the syndicate for survival. The result was a landscape where nearly every criminal act traced back, in some way, to the same source. Whether it was a nightclub brawl in Vancouver, a shipment seized in Montreal, or a drug overdose in Calgary, the shadow of the syndicate loomed behind it all. For law enforcement, frustration grew with every failed operation. Surveillance would catch glimpses of activity, but never enough to build a full case. Financial trails often led to shell companies, offshore accounts, or businesses that appeared legitimate. Every time investigators thought they had found a weak link, it dissolved into nothing. The syndicate anticipated police moves, adjusting their strategies with frightening precision. It was as though they were always one step ahead, as if they had studied not only crime, but also the very system meant to stop it. What began as whispers in Toronto's alleys had become a nationwide reality. The syndicate was no longer hiding. In the shadows, they had become the shadows themselves. To the public, life carried on with clubs buzzing, trucks driving, and businesses thriving. But beneath that illusion, an empire of crime had spread across Canada, built on fear, silence, and blood buried deep in the snow. For years, the syndicate seemed untouchable. Their quiet rise, their bloody warnings, and their expansion across the country had created an illusion of invincibility. To the outside world, they were ghosts who left no evidence behind. To the underworld, they were kings who ruled without needing to shout. But even the strongest empires eventually begin to crumble, not from the outside, but from within. The cracks in the syndicate's empire started small, almost invisible. Greed, suspicion, and betrayal. These were forces that no amount of discipline could suppress forever. Two lieutenants at the heart of the syndicate, men who had once worked side by side to expand the empire's reach, began competing for control. Each wanted to be seen as the true heir to the syndicate's leadership, and each was willing to take risks that went against the organization's most sacred rule: never attract unnecessary attention. One began forging reckless deals with suppliers in Montreal, flooding the streets with more drugs than ever before, while the other secretly built alliances with smaller gangs in Vancouver, promising them power in exchange for loyalty. These moves were bold, but they were sloppy. The discipline that had once defined the syndicate was slowly being replaced by ambition and desperation. The first major fracture came in a Montreal warehouse. A drug exchange that should have gone smoothly ended in chaos. When one lieutenant attempted to cut the other out of the deal, guns were drawn, and within minutes the warehouse floor was soaked in blood. 10 men lay dead by the time the gunfire stopped. It was the largest single massacre linked to the syndicate in years, and unlike their earlier operations, this one was messy and loud. The city awoke to headlines of the bloodbath, and for the first time, the syndicate's silence had been broken. The massacre shook the underworld. Smaller gangs who had once feared the syndicate now saw weakness. They whispered that the ghosts had lost control, that the empire was no longer as disciplined as it once had been. For law enforcement, the bloodshed was both a tragedy and an opportunity. The violence gave them the justification they needed to escalate their efforts. A joint task force was created, bringing together police from multiple provinces along with federal investigators.